So my name is Brian McGill. I'm from the University of Maine, and I'm working on a project looking at rural forests and the relationship to large cities that are oftentimes nearby. So as an example, I live in central Maine, which is heavily forested, but at the same time, Boston's only 4 hours away, and we notice a significant impact. And we're looking at, there are a number of flows back and forth. There are people who move in both directions, people who are leaving the city and people who are moving into the cities. A number of important ecosystem services, things that people value, come out of the forest for those cities. Things like water quality and water quantity oftentimes are quite important to have those forests. And of course, the big one is just amenities, which is a fancy word for having fun, recreation, vacation, things like that. Meanwhile, back in the forested areas, a lot of what's happening is you're seeing lots and lots of houses being built. It's not like what you see in a city or in the suburbs, where there's just a kind of giant footprint of pavement that's marching out. It's often quite low density development, a few houses per square kilometer sometimes. But this can, in turn, have significant impacts on the forest, on the quality of life, on the economics in those forested areas. And so that's what we're looking at. We're using satellite data to assess the historic changes for the last 40 years, and then trying to develop some scenarios to understand the trajectories going forward. The potential impact for this on people and the reason that I'm excited about this project are really the same thing, which is I think I forgot to mention, we're looking at 3 regions. We're looking at New England. I'm based in Maine, but looking at New England broadly. We're looking at Oregon, and we're looking at the upper Midwest, places like Minnesota, Wisconsin, and then in a little bit of a contrast, a place like Ohio, which is naturally originally forested, but at this point is mostly cities and agriculture. So we're looking at that contrast across those 3 areas. There's a number of interesting differences and similarities. Similarities being forests and cities, that's the same across. Some of the differences: in Oregon, more than 50% of the land is owned by the federal government, whereas in Maine, less than 5%, I think it's 2%, is owned by the federal government. Almost all the land is owned by private individuals. So there are a lot of interest, and planning is much more centralized in Oregon. It occurs at the county and state level. In Maine, it occurs at the town level. Every individual town gets to determine its own destiny. So there are a lot of interesting contrasts, and that we're looking at how those have effects. And then we're trying to look at taking that forward into the future, what kinds of changes could be expected to happen, and looking at different scenarios. What happens if local agriculture really takes off? How's that going to change things? Probably means some forests get cut down. But what happens if there's no restrictions on urban development and vacation homes, and these just continue to come in at higher and higher densities? What happens if everything gets put into parks? These are different kinds of scenarios, and we're trying to look at those contrasts and help policymakers understand what's going to happen with that. As somebody who lives in one of these regions, it's something that's on everybody's mind. I know in Maine, there's a real sense that we're kind of at a fork in the road, and we can go in several different directions, and some of which could turn out to be an absolute disaster. And we could end up, in the I-95 corridor, looking like New York City, which would be not where we want to go in Maine. But at the same time, we have to find a path where we go forward, where we can maintain the lifestyle and the quality of life and the natural environment, but also at the same time, have an appropriate level of economic development. So that's the challenge, and that's what we're looking to help inform, is to look at the changes historically and changes under these different scenarios, and help policymakers thread that needle to a quality of life future in these regions.